The quaintness of the town I had recently moved to was its charm. Nestled between rolling hills and picturesque landscapes, it was a breath of fresh air from the city's relentless pace. I'm a journalist by trade and a curious soul by nature. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a local legend that piqued my interest: the Pale Gardener. I first heard about it in hushed tones at the local café. The owner, Mrs. Haversham, had caught me eyeing an old faded photograph of a lush garden on the wall. "That's the old botanical garden," she said, her voice lowering. "Haven't been tended to in years. They say it's haunted by the Pale Gardener." The words sent a thrill through me. Ghost stories and legends had always been a fascination of mine, and this sounded like the perfect subject for my next article. The garden, as I learned, lay on the outskirts of the town, shrouded in neglect and wild growth. Driven by a mix of professional curiosity and personal intrigue, I decided to visit the garden that weekend. The path leading to it was overgrown, almost as if nature itself was trying to hide it away from prying eyes. As I pushed through the brambles, the sight that greeted me was eerie yet mesmerizing. The garden was a strange blend of beauty and decay. Roses, their petals vibrant against the dull thorns, wound their way through the rusted gates. Statues, once proud and majestic, now stood weathered and moss-covered, their expressions distorted by time. But what truly caught my attention was the air of the garden. It felt as if something, or someone, was watching me. The leaves rustled without a breeze, and shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. A chill ran down my spine, but my journalist instincts urged me to venture deeper. As I walked, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being followed. Every crunch of the underbrush made me turn, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. It was as if the garden itself was alive, breathing down my neck. I made my way to the heart of the garden, where the plants were the thickest. The air here was heavy, almost suffocating. That's when I saw a patch of soil that looked recently tended to, surrounded by flowers that seemed too vibrant, too live compared to the rest. I knelt down, examining the soil. It was loose, freshly turned. My mind raced with questions. Who would tend to a garden long forgotten? What secrets did this place hold? I decided then, as the setting sun cast long shadows over the garden, that I would uncover the mystery of the Pale Gardener. Little did I know, my life was about to entwine with a tale of sorrow, vengeance, and a haunting that would leave its mark on me forever. My curiosity about the Pale Gardener had turned into an obsession. I spent the following days digging through the town's history, trying to piece together the story behind the old botanical garden. The local library became my second home, the dusty archives my treasure trove. I learned about the garden's former glory, a verdant oasis created by a passionate gardener named Elias Thorne. His dedication was renowned, and the garden was his life's work. But his story ended in tragedy. Betrayed and brutally murdered in his own sanctuary, his body was found among the withering plants he so dearly loved. After his death, the garden was left to decay, a symbol of the town's collective guilt. With each piece of the puzzle, the legend of the Pale Gardener took a more definite shape in my mind. It was said that Elias's spirit couldn't find peace, rising to tend to the neglected garden, and seeking vengeance against those who disrespected nature. The next weekend, armed with my camera and a notepad, I returned to the garden. The atmosphere felt different this time, heavier, as if charged with an unseen energy. I ventured deeper, past the overgrown archways and ivy-clad statues. As the sunlight waned, I found myself in a secluded part of the garden, where the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. It was there, in the dimming light, that I first saw him, the Pale Gardener. He was exactly as the legends described. An emaciated figure, skin as pale as the moon, eyes dark hollows in a gaunt face. He wore tattered garden attire, and his hands were caked in a mix of soil and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Frozen in place, I watched as he tended to the plants with an eerie gentleness. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. I reached for my camera, my heart pounding in my chest, but as the shutter clicked, he stopped and turned towards me. His gaze was piercing, filled with an indescribable mix of sorrow and rage. Vines began to stir at his feet, creeping towards me like serpents ready to strike. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backwards, fleeing through the undergrowth as the vines lashed out, grazing my ankle. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the streetlights. Looking back, the garden was still, nothing but shadows and whispers of wind. But I knew what I had seen, and the cut on my ankle was proof that it wasn't just my imagination. That night, I lay awake, the image of the Pale Gardener etched into my mind. I knew then that this story was more than just an article. It was a warning, a glimpse into a world where the boundaries between life and death, natural and supernatural, were blurred. And yet, a part of me yearned to go back, to uncover the truth hidden in the heart of that forsaken garden. In the days that followed my encounter with the Pale Gardener, I became consumed with the mystery surrounding him. Every waking moment was dedicated to unraveling the truth, but with each revelation, my sense of unease grew. I began to notice strange occurrences around me. Plants in my apartment, previously struggling to survive, flourished overnight, their vines stretching towards me as if reaching out. I'd wake up to the sound of rustling leaves, even though the windows were closed and the air was still. My dreams were haunted by images of the garden, twisted and grotesque. In these nightmares, I was trapped, ensnared by thorns and vines, while the pale gardener loomed over me, his hollow eyes boring into my soul. I'd wake up in cold sweats, my ankle throbbing where the vine had cut me. Despite the fear and the nightmares, my journalistic instincts pushed me further. I interviewed townsfolk, gently probing for stories about the garden. Most were reluctant to speak, their eyes darting away, their voices dropping to whispers. But bit by bit, I gathered their tales, stories of unexplained disappearances, pets gone missing, eerie sightings in the twilight hours. One account, in particular, stood out. An old man, Mr. Darrow, who lived on the edge of town, near the garden, spoke of nights when he'd hear soft whispers and the sound of someone tending to plants. He talked of a sadness that seemed to emanate from the garden, a palpable grief that lingered in the air. His words resonated with me, painting a picture of the pale gardener not just as a vengeful spirit, but as a soul in perpetual mourning, tied to the place of his betrayal and death. The more I learned, the more the line between obsession and fear blurred. I felt a connection to the pale gardener, an empathy for his plight, yet the terror of what he was capable of kept me awake at night. One evening, as I sat at my desk, poring over my notes, a sudden realization hit me. The garden was responding to my presence, my interest. It was as if the pale gardener knew of my investigations, and through some unearthly bond, was reaching out to me. I knew then that I couldn't let this go. I had to face the pale gardener again, to confront this entity and understand his story. As I prepared for my return, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of being drawn deeper into a story that was as much a part of me now as I was of it. The pale gardener and his forgotten garden had ensnared me, and there was no turning back. My decision to confront the pale gardener was one of both fear and fascination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a crimson hue over the town, the garden welcomed me with an eerie silence, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the waking world. Every step I took was deliberate, my senses heightened to the rustling leaves and the soft murmur of the wind. The deeper I ventured, the more I felt the oppressive presence of the pale gardener. I found him in the heart of the garden, amidst a grove of ancient trees, their branches twisted in sorrowful gestures. He stood still, his ghostly figure. Mustering my courage, I spoke. "I know your story, Elias Thorne. I know the pain and betrayal you suffered." At the sound of his name, he turned slowly to face me. His eyes, dark voids in the moonlight, fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. The garden seemed to respond to his agitation, the plants around us stirring restlessly. "I come not to harm," I continued, my voice barely a whisper, "but to understand, to share your story." For a moment, there was silence, a tension that hung heavily in the air. Then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a wail, he spoke, his words laced with the anguish of decades. "My garden was my life, my sanctuary. They took it from me, left me to die among the ruins of my dreams." His pain was palpable, echoing through the garden like a mournful dirge. The plants around us swayed as if in sympathy, their movements more pronounced. "I sought only to protect, to preserve," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "but in death, I am bound to avenge the desecration of nature, of my life's work." As he spoke, the garden came alive. Vines crept towards me, thorns glistening in the moonlight. In a desperate attempt to protect myself, I lit my torch, the flame casting an eerie glow on the surrounding floor. The pale gardener recoiled at the sight of the fire, his form flickering like a disturbed shadow. The garden reacted in kind, the plants retreating, their advance halted by the flame in my hand. In that moment of chaos and fear, I saw not just the vengeful spirit of the pale gardener, but the broken soul of Elias Thorne, a man whose love for his garden had transcended death itself. The confrontation ended as quickly as it began. With the garden quelled by the presence of fire, I made my escape, the pale gardener's mournful gaze following me, a silent plea for understanding and peace. As I emerged from the garden, the night air felt colder, the world around me eerily quiet. I knew then that the story of the pale gardener was far from over. But for now, I had survived the encounter, my mind a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. The line between the living and the dead, love and obsession, had been blurred, and I was left to ponder the consequences of my actions in the heart of that forsaken garden. The escape from the garden left me with a sense of profound disquiet. The encounter with the pale gardener, Elias Thorne, had revealed a depth of sadness and rage I hadn't fully anticipated. My mind was a tangle of emotions as I made my way back to my apartment, the events of the night replaying like a haunting melody. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the town, I sat at my desk, my thoughts still ensnared by the garden and its ghostly caretaker. The notes I had taken seemed trivial now, the photographs inadequate to capture the true essence of what I had experienced. The garden had become a part of me, its story intertwined with my own. I felt a responsibility to tell Elias's story, to bring to light the tragedy and betrayal he had suffered. But as I began to write, I struggled with the weight of the truth and the fear of its consequences. Days passed, and the garden's influence on my life grew. Plants in my apartment flourished unnaturally, vines creeping along walls and windowsills, as if reaching out to me. I began to avoid mirrors, unnerved by the reflection of my own eyes, which seemed to hold a depth of knowledge and sorrow that was not entirely my own. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of a presence lingering just beyond my perception. The line between reality and the supernatural had blurred, leaving me in a state of constant vigilance. Then came the night when the garden's reach extended beyond my apartment. A fire broke out in the botanical garden, its flames visible from my window. My heart sank at the sight. In my attempt to confront the pale gardener, I had brought a destructive force into his sanctuary. The fire was eventually contained, but the damage was done. The once overgrown, wild beauty of the garden was now charred and blackened, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the irreversible impact of our actions. In the aftermath of the fire, I was left to reflect on my encounter with the pale gardener. The garden's destruction weighed heavily on me, a burden of guilt and regret. I had sought to understand and share Elias's story, but in doing so, I had inadvertently become an agent of the very destruction he abhorred. The haunting presence of the pale gardener lingered in my mind, a ghostly reminder of the fine line between curiosity and intrusion, empathy and folly. As I penned the final words of my article, I realized that some stories, like some gardens, are best left untended, their secrets preserved in the shadows of history and legend. In the wake of the garden's partial destruction, the town seemed to hold its breath. The story of the fire and its mysterious origins became the subject of hushed conversations and speculative whispers. As for me, I found myself in a state of introspective silence, grappling with the repercussions of my actions. My article on the pale gardener, now complete, sat heavily on my desk. It was a detailed account of Elias Thorne's tragic tale, the legend of the garden, and my personal encounters with the spectral gardener. Yet, I hesitated to publish it. The responsibility of sharing such a story, with its blend of sorrow and supernatural, weighed on me. After much contemplation, I submitted the article, framing it as a cautionary tale about respecting the mysteries of nature and the past. It was published to much acclaim, with readers fascinated by the blend of local history and ghostly legend. But for me, the story was far from over. The garden, though scarred, remained a place of enigmatic beauty. Rumors circulated that the pale gardener was still seen tending to the surviving plants, his figure a ghostly silhouette in the moonlit nights. These stories brought a mix of fear and curiosity to the town, but I stayed away, respecting the boundary I had once crossed. One evening, as I walked past the outskirts of the garden, I felt a pull, a whisper in the wind calling me. I resisted, reminded of the consequences of my last encounter. But as I glanced towards the garden, I saw a young child peering through the fence, eyes wide with wonder. In that moment, I realized the cycle of fascination and fear would continue, the legend of the pale gardener living on in the hearts and minds of those who dared to venture close. The garden had become a symbol of the unknown, a place where the natural and the supernatural coexisted, and where the memory of Elias Thorne lingered, a guardian of the forgotten and neglected. As I walked away, leaving the garden and its ghostly inhabitant behind, I felt a sense of closure. The story of the pale gardener was out there, a part of the town's lore now. But for me, it was a chapter close, a journey through fear, empathy, and understanding that would forever remain etched in my memory. The pale gardener, with his sorrowful vigil over the garden, stood as a reminder of the delicate balance between man and nature, life and death, curiosity and respect. And as the last light of day faded, giving way to the shadows of night, I knew that while the story had ended, the legend would live on, whispered in the winds, and rooted in the earth of the old enigmatic garden.